Today's story is a Bible adventure one about Finbar the fish. Finbar was one of the biggest fish in the sea. He was so big that he frightened all the other smaller fishes away. That meant he was quite lonely, and often, because he had no one to play with, he was bored. He just seemed to spend his time swimming round and round in circles and doing very little. He wondered why God had made him so big and so useless. One day, that all changed forever. There was a very great storm in the sea. People like us would have been scared stiff, but Finbar was delighted. He loved a good splash. He swam right towards the action, ready to enjoy the fun. It was then that he looked up to the surface of the water and saw the little ship. It was being tossed about by the wind and waves, and it looked like it was going to sink. The sailors were terrified. They had thrown a lot of boxes and stuff overboard to make the ship lighter, and now they were about to throw a passenger called Jonah into the sea. Jonah had been very disobedient. God had told him to go to a city called Nineveh in the east and preach to the people there, and instead Jonah was trying to sail to the west, doing the very opposite of what God had asked him to do. Jonah thought that maybe the storm was God's way of teaching him a lesson. He thought that if the sailors threw him out, then perhaps the storm would stop. Jonah was right. The storm stopped the very moment he hit the water. He went down, down, down into the sea. It was horrible. He felt the cold and the seaweed all around him. He couldn't breathe. He was sure he was about to die. Just then, God and Finbar sprang into action. God told Finbar to do something really revolting. He told him to swallow Jonah. Imagine! Finbar was shocked. He had only ever eaten smaller fish. He had never ever dreamt of swallowing anything as big as a man. He wasn't even sure he could manage it, and he couldn't begin to think why God would want him to do it. Still, thought Finbar, if God tells you to do something, he must have his reasons. I'm going to do what God says. Gulp. It wasn't easy, but Finbar opened his mouth really wide, and poor Jonah slipped down Finbar's throat in one go. Finbar was sure that was the end of Jonah. Poor Jonah thought the same thing. He was sure he was going to die, but he didn't. There in the darkness of Finbar's tummy, he lay for 3 long days. It was slimy and horrible, but it saved his life. While there, Jonah realized how wrong he had been to disobey God and run away from what God had asked him to do. Why? Even this huge fish had been obedient and had carried out God's wishes. Jonah was ashamed. He asked God's forgiveness and made up his mind to obey God better in the future. God heard Jonah's prayer. Just then, Finbar started to feel very funny, like you do when you're going to be sick. His tummy heaved, and suddenly Jonah popped right back out of his mouth. Even better than that, Jonah found himself on dry land. He was covered in slimy stuff, but he was safe and sound. And Finbar simply swam away, quietly from the beach. He felt wonderful. He knew his job was over. He had done exactly what God had asked him to do. He had played his part in a very important story, and he sensed that God was very pleased with him. He would not think of himself as useless ever again. Jonah never forgot what had happened, and it even got put into the Bible. From then on, he knew that God's way was the best way. He was always going to do what God told him from now on. So he did end up going to the city of Nineveh, as God had told him to. He preached to the people there, and they listened and believed the message that Jonah had received from God. Jonah was a changed man. After all, it's not every day you learn a lesson from a fish.